What if one decision, made in a split second, could expose everything you thought you knew about someone? It was just a regular flight, or so they thought, nothing out of the ordinary. But for a wealthy family, a seemingly small choice would soon ignite a chain of events they never saw coming. They chose to move seats, to avoid sitting near a man they judged based on nothing more than the color of his skin. They didn't know his name, didn't know his story, but that didn't stop them. To them, he was just another passenger, a stranger with no significance. What they didn't know was that this man, the one they thought they could dismiss so easily, wasn't just anybody. And soon, they'd learn that their assumption would cost them more than they could ever imagine. Stick around, because this is a story that will make you rethink everything about how we judge others. The moment the family boarded the plane, it was clear they belonged to a world of wealth and privilege. The father, wearing an expensive suit, adjusted his cufflinks with precision, his movements a testament to years of a life built on status. His wife, meticulously groomed, exuded an air of self-assuredness as she guided their teenage children to their seats. The daughter, dressed in a designer outfit, walked with a sense of entitlement that only the very wealthy seemed to carry, while the son, the younger of the two, scrolled through his phone without so much as a glance at his surroundings. As they approached their row, a calm, well-dressed black man entered the plane, his presence almost too understated in comparison to their ostentatious display. His attire was sharp, a tailored suit, perfectly pressed and polished shoes. His confidence radiated from him, but he carried no airs of arrogance. He walked with the quiet assurance of someone who had already accomplished what they set out to do, but kept it to themselves. The man made his way down the aisle, heading directly toward the row the family had claimed. As he moved closer, the father stiffened imperceptibly, a slight discomfort flickering in his eyes. His wife's gaze followed him, her polite smile faltering just for a moment. The teenage daughter exchanged a quick glance with her brother, then whispered something in his ear. The son gave a slight dismissive nod before both siblings shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Then, without hesitation, the father cleared his throat. "Actually, I think we'd prefer to sit over here," he said, his voice smooth but edged with a hint of forced politeness. The mother followed suit, smiling sweetly as she slid her hand onto her husband's arm. "Yes, this seat seems more comfortable, don't you think?" she added, glancing toward the man's row. It wasn't a loud rejection, but the implication was clear. They weren't comfortable sharing space with him. The man paused, his expression unreadable, but he said nothing. Instead, he offered them a polite nod, watching as the family quickly moved to seats further down the aisle, eager to put as much distance as possible between them and him. As the family settled into their new seats, the man continued his journey down the aisle, taking his place in the row they had just vacated. His posture remained relaxed, and he adjusted his cufflinks with a quiet elegance. He didn't react to the slight. It seemed as if he had long since become accustomed to people like them. But as the plane taxied to the runway, the discomfort the family felt became increasingly evident. The teenage daughter nervously tapped her foot against the floor, glancing around as if searching for something familiar. Her brother, usually unfazed by the world around him, sat with his arms crossed, his lips pressed into a thin line. The father fiddled with his phone, though it was clear he wasn't actually looking at it. The mother, always the one to keep up appearances, shifted in her seat, glancing at her husband for reassurance. Their actions spoke volumes. Despite the outward appearance of ease, something wasn't sitting right with them. It wasn't the plane, or the weather, or the seats. It was their decision to distance themselves from the man. A decision they'd told themselves was based on comfort. But deep down, they knew it had been based on something else entirely. Meanwhile, across the aisle, the man remained composed. He settled into his seat with a sense of calm that stood in stark contrast to the quiet tension simmering just a few rows away. The passengers near him spoke to him with casual friendliness, offering a smile, exchanging pleasantries as if they were all just fellow travelers, sharing the same journey. No discomfort, no unease, just respect. But for the family, the distance they'd created felt like a barrier they couldn't cross, no matter how hard they tried to justify their actions. Every moment of the flight was filled with a nagging sense of guilt, though no one dared to admit it out loud. Instead, they all did what people often do when faced with discomfort. They tried to ignore it. But as the flight continued, something began to shift. The unease among the family grew, but it wasn't because of the man. It was because, for the first time, they began to wonder if their judgment had been wrong. Something inside them was telling them they had miscalculated. Something wasn't adding up, yet they still couldn't bring themselves to acknowledge it. So they sat in silence, surrounded by their privilege, trying to convince themselves that it was all just about the seats, about their comfort. But the deeper truth was that the discomfort wasn't just about proximity, it was about who they thought they were avoiding, and who they would later realize they had underestimated. As the flight cruised higher, the calm atmosphere within the cabin was suddenly shattered. The plane hit turbulence, a sharp, jarring shake that made the passengers uneasy. The cabin buzzed with quiet murmurs as the flight attendants quickly moved into action. Passengers gripped their armrests, some with white-knuckled tension, others muttering under their breath. But amidst the growing unease, there was one person who remained unshaken. The black man, seated just a few rows ahead of the wealthy family, didn't flinch. His posture was as relaxed as it had been when the flight first began. He didn't clutch his seat, didn't look around nervously. He simply sat there, calmly reading a book, his fingers flipping the pages with a measured ease. The turbulence seemed to intensify, but still, he remained undisturbed. The family, in stark contrast, were visibly shaken. The mother reached for her husband's hand, squeezing it tightly. The father tried to hide his discomfort by pretending to focus on his phone, but his tight jaw and the nervous flicks of his eyes told a different story. The teenage children exchanged worried glances, their earlier irritation now turning into unease. They looked at each other, then back at the man, whose calmness seemed almost unsettling. For a brief moment, the man glanced around, catching the eye of one of the flight attendants as she passed by. The stewardess hesitated for a fraction of a second, as if taken aback by his serene presence in the midst of the chaos. She smiled politely, but there was something else in her expression. Respect, perhaps, or maybe curiosity. As she moved down the aisle, she paused near his seat, engaging in a quiet conversation with him. Her voice, though soft, carried an air of reverence. The family, sitting only a few rows behind, caught snippets of their exchange. The stewardess mentioned something about, as the minutes passed, the family's quiet regret began to bubble up to the surface. The mother's fingers nervously tapped the armrest, her thoughts racing. What if they had been wrong about him? What if this man was someone far more significant than they had realized? But even as they grappled with their inner turmoil, they still couldn't bring themselves to acknowledge it. The father, ever the one to maintain control, leaned back in his seat, attempting to regain his composure. The teenage son sat still, his arms crossed in front of him, but his mind clearly elsewhere. And the daughter, who had first whispered to her brother about the man's presence, was now staring at him with a mixture of curiosity and regret. The atmosphere inside the cabin had shifted, but the wealthy family could not quite put their finger on why. They had started with assumptions, and now they were left with uncertainty that was impossible to ignore. As the plane began its descent, the tension that had been simmering for the duration of the flight reached its peak. The wealthy family, though still trying to maintain their composed appearance, was now a bundle of nerves. Their earlier judgment of the black man had started to eat away at them, but none of them knew how to address it, nor were they willing to admit they had been wrong. They gathered their belongings, avoiding each other's gaze, each lost in their own quiet discomfort. The father double-checked his phone. The mother absent-mindedly ran her fingers through her hair, and the children were too preoccupied with their thoughts to speak. Just as the plane touched down and the seatbelt sign was turned off, something happened that would forever change the way the family viewed the events of the past few hours. The black man, who had remained calm and composed throughout the flight, stood up from his seat. He straightened his suit, his movements sharp and purposeful. For a moment, no one took notice. Most passengers were already preoccupied with preparing to disembark. But then the man turned toward the flight crew. "Thank you for the smooth flight. I'll be in touch regarding the arrangements for the next trip," he said, his voice carrying an air of command. His tone wasn't arrogant but authoritative, calm, direct, and professional. As he continued speaking, a few of the crew members exchanged knowing looks and nodded respectfully. One of the flight attendants, who had earlier spoken to him, addressed him with deference. "Of course, Mr. Morgan. We'll have everything ready for you." The name Mr. Morgan hung in the air like a weight, and at that very moment, everything shifted. The family members froze. The mother, who had been subtly organizing her things, stilled. Her hands trembled slightly. The father's face drained of color, his grip on his briefcase tightening until his knuckles turned white. The teenage children, who had been whispering to each other in hushed tones, suddenly went silent. They all looked at each other, exchanging stunned glances, each trying to process what they had just overheard. Mr. Morgan. The name lingered in the air, a symbol of something the family hadn't quite understood until now. It was then that the full weight of the situation dawned on them. The man they had dismissed, the man they had so casually moved away from, thinking little of, was someone of significant influence, someone whose name was recognized in business circles, whose reputation spanned industries, someone who didn't need to prove anything to anyone. The father's face slowly turned pale as the realization sank in. The black man wasn't just any businessman, he was the CEO of a major global corporation. His company was known for its innovations, its philanthropic efforts, and its leadership in the tech industry. His face appeared on the cover of magazines, and his name was synonymous with success. But more than that, he was a philanthropist, a board member of several prominent institutions, and a leader in causes that supported education, equality, and economic empowerment. The father, who had once believed his own success was what defined him, now found himself dwarfed by the man he had so carelessly judged. As the black man moved to exit the plane, the air seemed to thicken around the family. Each member of the family, from the father down to the children, felt the sting of shame, their earlier behavior now exposed in the harsh light of reality. They had assumed he was just another passenger, someone beneath them in their world of wealth and influence. They had misjudged him, not just because of the color of his skin, but because of their own inflated sense of self-importance. The teenage children, who had once whispered about the man, now felt a sharp pang of regret. They realized how foolish their earlier behavior had been. The daughter, who had made faces and muttered under her breath, now felt the full weight of her actions. The son, who had rolled his eyes when his parents insisted on moving seats, now sat in stunned silence. Neither of them could look at their parents. The father, who had been so quick to assume the man's place in the world, now found himself on the receiving end of a humbling truth. The black man, the CEO, the philanthropist, was someone far beyond his own sphere of influence. And in that moment, he realized that his earlier decisions had been not just ignorant, but damaging. His pride had prevented him from seeing the bigger picture, and now that ignorance was staring him in the face. The mother, once so certain of her social grace, felt small. She had been the one to insist they move seats, to avoid sitting next to him. She had been the one to justify their actions, claiming it was for comfort. But now she could feel the discomfort settle deep in her chest. She had misjudged a man based on nothing but preconceived notions, and in doing so had embarrassed herself and her family. As the black man walked toward the exit, his calm demeanor never wavered. He didn't glance back at the family who had so thoughtlessly rejected him. But as he passed, there was an unspoken message in his movement, his self-assured walk, his confident stride, his quiet authority. It was as if he was saying, "You may have judged me today, but the truth is, I don't need your approval." The family, left behind in their seats, couldn't help but feel the weight of their mistake. It was a moment that would stay with them long after the flight ended, and though they had no idea who this man truly was, when they first dismissed him, they would never forget the lesson they had learned. The lesson that their assumptions, however well-intentioned, could be their undoing. It was too late to apologize now, but the truth was unmistakable. They had underestimated the man, and in doing so had underestimated the very essence of what true power and influence meant. The rich and privileged had been taught a humbling lesson in humility. As the plane door opened and passengers began filing out, the wealthy family remained seated a moment longer, their earlier conversation now reduced to uneasy silence. The mother, who had once maintained her poise with an almost mechanical grace, was now visibly shaken. Her face, once composed, showed the faintest traces of uncertainty, her hands trembling slightly as she gathered her belongings. She stared ahead, her eyes unfocused, as if she were replaying the events of the flight over and over again in her mind. She couldn't escape the growing realization of how quickly they had judged him. Her thoughts circled back to the moment they had decided to move seats. It had seemed so trivial at the time, an innocent decision made out of a desire for comfort. But now, the weight of that decision crushed her. She had dismissed him without ever considering who he might be. Now, she couldn't shake the thought of what that said about her. Her own bias, her own prejudices had clouded her judgment, and in doing so, she had unknowingly robbed herself of the opportunity to engage with someone far more remarkable than she could have imagined. Her husband, normally the pillar of confidence in the family, now seemed diminished. His usually calm demeanor was nowhere to be found. He glanced at her with guilt in his eyes but said nothing. Both of them, without a word spoken, knew they had made a terrible mistake. Yet neither of them was willing to admit it out loud. It was a prideful silence, a refusal to acknowledge what they had done wrong, even as the consequences of their actions settled heavily over them. The teenage children, who had once whispered in judgment, now found themselves trapped in a world of self-reflection. They had thought of themselves as more open-minded, more enlightened than their peers. Yet here they were, realizing they had been just as guilty of prejudice as anyone else. The daughter, who had once snickered behind her hand, felt a deep, aching shame. She had assumed she knew everything about the man just by looking at him. She had assumed she could judge him based on nothing more than his appearance. Now, she understood how wrong she had been. Her brother sat next to her, equally quiet. He couldn't help but think about the brief but telling conversation he had overheard between the black man and the flight crew. The man had spoken with such authority, such calm assurance, and the respect with which the staff had treated him was undeniable. It was as if the world he had dismissed so casually, based solely on a few fleeting moments, was something far more complicated. He began to realize that the man's calmness wasn't just a reaction to the turbulence or the situation, it was a reflection of something far deeper. The son's thoughts drifted back to their earlier assumption that the man was just another passenger, perhaps someone with no importance. He realized now that such judgments were not only unfair, but dangerous, as they allowed him to miss seeing the full picture of who a person really was. His own arrogance, masked as indifference, had been exposed in that single fleeting moment. The family walked off the plane in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The bustling of the other passengers around them, the sound of luggage being wheeled down the aisles, seemed far away, like a distant echo. They were each too absorbed in their own realization of what they had done. As they passed through the jet bridge and made their way into the terminal, no one spoke a word. The mother's quiet discomfort was mirrored in the father's stiff gait, and the children's once lively chatter was replaced by a heavy quiet. The weight of their mistake, their rushed judgment, their assumptions, pressed on them like an unshakable burden. Though they would never speak of it, the moment had shifted something inside each of them. The family left the plane not just with their bags, but with a humbling lesson about the power of prejudice and the damage it could do. The lesson wasn't just about the man they had judged, it was about themselves. They had assumed they were in control of the situation, that their wealth and status defined their place in the world. But in that moment, they realized how quickly their assumptions could turn on them, how easily they could be humbled by their own narrow view of others. It was a lesson they would carry with them long after the flight had ended, though the cost of that lesson would linger much longer than any of them had anticipated. As the family walked away from the plane, weighed down by the consequences of their decision, we are left to reflect on the real cost of judgment. What do you think of the family's choice to avoid sitting next to the black man? Do you believe they were justified in their actions? Or do you think this twist was something they truly deserved? Was it a harmless move? Or did it say something deeper about the assumptions we make based on appearance? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and we want to hear your stories too. Has there ever been a time when you were judged based on your appearance? How did you handle it? Did it change your perspective on how we treat others? Share your experiences with us, because every story matters, and sometimes we can all learn from the way we see and judge one another. Your thoughts could be the ones that spark important conversations, so drop a comment below and let's discuss. If you found this story eye-opening, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more thought-provoking stories like this one. We bring you stories that challenge assumptions, open minds, and make us reflect on the world we live in. Don't forget to share your opinions in the comments. Whether you agree, disagree, or have your own take on this story, we want to hear from you. Your thoughts are what make these conversations truly impactful. Stay tuned for more, because the journey doesn't end here. This story serves as a powerful reminder. You can't judge a book by its cover. Sometimes, the most powerful people go unnoticed in the crowd, their worth and influence hidden behind an outward appearance. It's a humbling lesson for us all. Let's take a moment to reflect on our assumptions, the ones we make about others based on nothing more than what we see on the surface, and ask ourselves, what are we missing? We all have biases, but it's never too late to challenge them. And when we do, we might just uncover something truly remarkable about the people around us.